Okay, hey, so first video and first premise is going to be on space and dynamic. So firstly, hopefully you've read above the material we're going to use. The idea of these are that it's fairly open-ended, so regardless of where your instrumental ability is at, how you go about looking through that progression, I'm going to try and use stuff that already exists within chord shapes that you've got. So regardless of how you go about playing it, there should be enough by breaking up those shapes and utilising the notes in the position that you've got to apply these principles across the board, and hopefully will give you a feeling of more choices and more ways of creating variation and ideas in the parts you're playing. Obviously, all of these kind of ideas are hugely benefited by an increasing fretboard knowledge, which opens up where you can position things and chord voicings and scale shapes and all of this kind of stuff, common tones and things that are really useful, which I would refer you to, of course, the Musicademy electric course, which has a lot of that kind of stuff in. So all of these things hopefully are useful wherever you're at, and will then can be applied to everything as you develop as a player going forwards, which is ultimately what we're all trying to do. So first thing, despite the fact I'm sitting here with a guitar, is somewhat moot, because the first element I was going to talk about is space and dynamic, which is the idea of this video. So space, I mean basically silence and gaps in between what you're playing. So it's a bit of a cliche to say not playing is really effective, and it's the classic line is it's not the notes, it's the space between the notes, right? But it is very effective. So contrast ultimately, I think, is what makes things interesting in music and what creates interest and motion in the parts we play. And space dropping in and out is obviously a huge element of creating that contrast. So the encouraging thing is, regardless of how many options you feel you have when you approach a chord sheet and try to come up with ideas, you've already got an effective tool to begin with by choosing when to and when not to play. So there's already capacity here before you even have to start adjusting and coming up with ideas within what we're playing to create some engagement in the parts we do. So the obvious thing is, for quiet moments, stop playing. It's very easy, I think, however long you've been playing, forever and ever, to fall into the trap of starting at the beginning and playing straight through and stopping at the end. But obviously there's a huge amount of potency in bringing parts in and out. So being aware of the drop in dynamics, one thing the guitar's particularly good at is sitting in that kind of higher mid-range of things. And when you've got mainly vocal-based music, which is often the case in church and with worship teams, that we have a real ability to drop in and out and create flow and change based on the presence of the guitar, whether it's there or not at all. And you can drop out quite often if you have the benefit of being with a team where you've got a full rhythm section as well, without actually causing any major stopping or feeling of complete loss of pace or complete loss of motion that you would if you decided to stop playing as a bass player or a drummer, for example. So when playing, it's always helpful to think about how we can create the feeling of things pulling back by removing those parts where the guitar kind of sits. Conversely, I often find space is really good for builds as well. So when you hit maybe a pre-chorus or a section or a bridge coming back into chorus or something like that, I find that actually as the band starts to build, either sometimes completely dropping out the guitar is a really effective way of creating build, because the contrast that I find you notice from the absence of the guitar as things start to ramp up below it is really effective in leading into that crescendo and that build. So I often find it's good to consider sometimes dropping out at the start of builds, letting the band, the rhythm section, the rest of the rhythm section start to drive that crescendo, and then bring the guitar in. Sometimes just before it hits the top of the crescendo or the section you go into, and that use of a gap in your playing is really potent and kind of inverse, as you would expect. By playing nothing, you get a feeling of kind of increased build in the playing. So that's also a really good way of looking at it. The other thing that you can do with space, which is quite effective, is start to see how it can apply to your own play. So there's no need to fill every single beat, every single bar with some guitar to create a part. So, it's, if you've got, for example, our sample 4 bars, think about creating space in those parts. If you're going from your first chord and you've got common tones that can ring over, leaving the second chord, hitting the third chord, leaving the fourth chord, that kind of space starts to create a phrase. All I've done there is, we could change the shapes and not play anything just for the sake of demonstration. It's your E minor. But then you started to create a phrase out of effectively picking 2 notes of your chord shape and leaving some room in between. So it's always worth kind of starting to think about how air and space can really help in parts. Obviously, people often talk about listening to other players, and that's really effective with creating space and gaps and silence in our parts. You can have a really effective way of kind of shading in and giving character to other people's parts. So if you've got other instrumental parts that are quite central, quite strong, or thematic, you can do quite a lot by creating kind of contextual shade by not playing around them initially, especially. Again, it all comes down to contrast. If you've got a nice keys theme that maybe comes in for an instrumental, comes in as a bridge figure or something like that, you can quite effectively, if it's, for example, 4-bar phrase like our sample here, rather than just playing straight through behind that, by creating a gap the first time round or the first half or however many times, and then coming back in with your part, you can create a lot more depth and character to what another instrument's doing, where they may not have played anything different, they're playing the same thing on a loop, but by choosing to create space behind it with your own instrument, you create a whole other level of kind of depth to what they're doing there. So that's something people pointed out to me before that I've always found really useful. And in listening to people, again, it's often quite a it can be a bit uphill remembering to listen, because we get, it's so easy to get tunnel vision when we're playing and stop playing at the end. But it's really good. I always kind of try and think of it like the difference between walking with your head down when you're walking along the street and kind of looking up. The way it kind of brings everything in when you make a conscious effort to look up, it's kind of like looking up with your ears, as it were. So that's space and dynamic, which ties in really closely in the playing. It's easy to again think of dynamic as loud or not loud, but have a think about what you're trying to convey in the playing. I think often a lot of what comes out in any instrument in our playing is our kind of intention. So it's not always as much as just thinking, I'm going to play this loud, and then creating a technical method by which to play it loud by digging in hard or by hitting it harder. But just that degree of kind of awareness and intent of brain, I think, often comes out in people's playing. So the smallest amount of dynamic intention, I think, is really effective because you're contributing to the whole of the band. So as you are aware of parts, maybe in the lyrics, maybe in the feel of the song that it's trying to convey, before we even start coming up with new stuff or interesting things you can do with chord shapes you might play, even by picking an arpeggio, in that shape with two different intentions, you know, just to dig in a little bit more, just to know that the lyrics are kind of lifting, or the congregation is kind of lifting, creates a huge amount of colour and shade. And all, you know, it's not just a case of the band are going to get quieter, so we get quieter with them and louder, which is obviously a part of it, but within your own phrases, even a small amount of that kind of dynamic adjustment, you know, coming up slightly towards the beginning, towards the end of a phrase, on your fourth bar, if it's leading back round, something like that, all contributes to kind of the ebb and flow of the feel of the overall band, not just the rising and falling of the song in itself. So it's definitely worth kind of thinking that when we're trying to create parts on the fly, just having a listening to the dynamics of not just the intent of the lyrics, but also the voice of the lead vocals and where they're going dynamically, the vibe of the room and the congregation. And as the name would express, dynamics do lend dynamism to the music itself, and creates that kind of reactionary and interactive element to the other players in the room. So yeah, I hope that kind of makes sense. That is space and dynamic. Next one will probably involve a little bit more touching the guitar, and not just sitting with it as an object. So yeah, space and dynamic. Have a think about how you would normally play. And already there's kind of tools to create variation, to create contrast, and to create a kind of interactive and kind of flexible way of playing what we've already got in our toolbox to begin with. Cool. Let's move on to number 2.